Pseudo Asian, raging racist, late bloomer. Today on The Pursuit, Dan Hyun. Welcome to The Pursuit, unfiltered conversations with faith leaders about their journey to pursue God. I'm your host, Richard Lee, and today my guest is Dan Hyun. Dan is the founding pastor of the Village Church in Baltimore, started with the dreams of making God famous through a multicultural expression of the kingdom. He's the founder also of the Ethnos Conference to lead the church in conversations about multicultural mission and reconciliation. He serves on the Send Network developing urban church planters and is a requested speaker on the issues of ministry and mission and justice and leadership. But his journey of speaking about racial healing starts with his own story of racial hurting. So Dan, you grew up in Philly and you went to school in Pennsylvania and everything like that, right?
Yeah, most of my life since I was a young kid raised in the greater Philadelphia area.
Okay, so I asked Jenny Yang this because she grew up in Philly and lives in Baltimore just like you. If you had to pick a city, Philly or Baltimore?
Here's the way I'll answer that. If the Eagles and the Ravens ever met in the Super Bowl, I would obviously be rooting for both, but I would probably be watching quietly in my basement rooting for the Eagles. Though ultimately I would not be heartbroken if either team won.
And so what was it like growing up in this suburb of Philly as a Korean American back in the 80s?
Yeah, I'm getting old. It's my kids, they love to pull out our yearbook, my old yearbooks, and they pulled out my senior year yearbook, which is embarrassing now. But one of the quotes in there that, kind of a little bit of a cringy thing now, but I wrote in there, Pseudo Asian. So, and, a lot of my journey and what I even try to walk together with people is looking into your past and really trying to see, especially in areas of trauma and growth, how God has spoken to us. And as I look back now, and I think I hadn't fully recognized it then, obviously, but I didn't like being Asian. I mean, I was Asian and you just can't do anything about it because that's what you look like.
Right.
But there was probably a deep-seated shame, just a dislike of myself. So I was Asian, but I almost made a joke out of it because I really did not want to be that. I segmented my life into very dichotomous, I think, regions. And I wanted that. So, church life, that was probably my most Korean aspect of life. And I grew to really value friends I had, even in youth group. That was kind of my Korean side, if anything. I was pretty whitewashed, if we want to use that language, though. But, that's where I got my Korean. And in school, there were definitely some friends I had and some fantastic folks there were a few Asian Americans, not too many Koreans, but mainly Chinese Americans. But that was kind of a segment of life that was the more academic, science fair, that kind of deal. But again, there's some shame that I had to fight off. I look back, I didn't really want to be part of that crew, even though that was some of my natural tendencies. So I think I rebelled against that, really wanting to press into a non-Asian, which at the time I thought was the more cool crowd. And that's why I probably did things like play football and want to hang out with different people. And I almost associated being Asian as kind of the weaker people into school. It's who I am. I can't deny that, but I don't really want to do it. If anything, I've got to compensate in spite of it.
So you had mentioned going to church. What was your faith journey at this point when you were growing up?
Yeah, I was actually, I'm probably a stronger believer when I was younger in some ways. So I had, and this is a whole nother story later when I got older, that I was really far away from God, but I was a good kid. My parents, they raised me in a really good way to know Jesus. And so even in youth group, very active. I think I was even the president of our youth group at one time and had a real fire for God. So that was some of my earlier journey, especially before college.
So then you go off to Penn State and you take your faith with you, take your ethnicity with you. What was your faith journey and sort of ethnic journey there in Penn State?
And in that way, those two things were together. So probably when I went to school, it was the first time I ever spent all of my time with other Korean Americans and some other Asian Americans, but mainly Korean Americans. I got very involved in the church and the fellowship there. And I loved it, probably for the beginning part of my college life. But I think I was going through my own spiritual journey So depending on the theological acumen of the people I talk to, some people tell me I wasn't saved. I'm pretty sure I had salvation in Christ. But again, but that's not a debate worth having. But I fell away really hard.
Okay.
So it's never that I said I hated God, but I think I didn't really understand grace and had a lot of guilt and shame and fear associated with trying to be obedient. So when I first went to college, that was my whole relational association with people in church, Asian American fellowships there.
Yeah.
And I still kept some of that, but I really moved hard because I found some other friends who that wasn't their crew. And I really liked that because I think I even felt a deeper sense of belonging
Uh-huh.
with other Korean American dudes who were not the nicest people, like in terms of like well behaved, all that, but just who I loved. And that was my main group. So
Hmm.
college was probably the time in my life and the whole, a long time of it, 6 years, where fell pretty hard away from God and got into some pretty destructive behaviors as well. Yeah, I would still go to church every so often, but really internally, but also externally, pretty far away from God.
When you were far away from God, what was going through your mind? Like, were you cognizant of the fact that you were far from God? Like, was it a willful decision, or was it just not even on the radar?
Oh, it was definitely very willful. So for me, I tend to have an extreme personality. So whatever I do, I'm going to go full out. So my goal used to be the best Christian, and I would try really hard. But I think I came to a place where I said, I just can't do this. So,
Yeah.
but I can be bad pretty easily. So, got into some destructive personal habits,
Yeah.
but also became very violently angry. And I think something I look back on now, I think I had some of that heart, even when we were talking about as a younger kid. I was really shy when I was younger, but really
Mm.
smiley, kind of just happy to be there. And my greatest desire was just to be accepted by larger majority culture, white culture. I just wanted to be that. I didn't want to cause a stir. But I think what I recognized where there was a deeper layer of anger and frustration. Some of it was at who I was, probably, hating the way I was made and doing anything I could to be something different. What I would say is if I were just born white, life would be so much better. But that creates a sense of anger and frustration. And when I
Yeah.
went to college, then I think for the first time in my life, I encountered a bunch of guys who are not ashamed to be Korean. If anything, they fully pressed into that.
Mm.
And if they encountered something on the street, someone making a ching chongy sound or making funny eyes, you just knock them out. Like I had never really experienced that before, but I loved it.
What do you mean, like getting a street fight?
Oh yeah, yeah. Like
Oh
there was a
man.
period like I thought, I feel like we would, just a normal few years where just you get really hammered and then you go out and you get in these fights, sometimes with one another, sometimes with other people that you're at the place with, but oftentimes just out in the community. And I knew it was destructive, but there was a part of it that also felt empowering.
Yeah.
And so and it obviously everything's holistic. So it tied into my identity, faith. I would still say I
Sure.
loved God, but obviously there was an internal sense of rebellion from him, but there was also a very external one. But I think only looking back now, I recognize some of the other things that were driving that. Just a sense of
Yeah.
who I am and feeling the rage and anger at being a minority within the larger US and feeling for the first time, well, I'm going to do something about it.
Your 6 years in college, was that basically your experience all the way through?
Some of it, and I think some of the reason it was extended was, I just got into some bad life habits. So probably for like a year and a half straight, I think I dropped every semester, had to withdraw,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But also for a good year or so, part of this anger led me to obviously express it outwardly, especially in violent expressions. And one time I got in a fight, and my thing would begin to fight, run away after that. But after this one, someone had actually gotten my information and reported it to police. So I was brought into the police a few days afterwards, and I actually ended up getting arrested and having to go through a whole kind of court procedures, including getting thrown out of school. So I was out of school for a year. That's some of why things were extended.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was part of the journey, and it was probably at the height of my rage and also feeling pretty indestructible. But
Uh-huh.
I look back on it now and I just see the amazing mercy of God that He allowed me to go through those things, not because it was honoring to Him, but to kind of wake me up
Yeah.
and shake me out. I had a amazing friend who offered me a job with his family's business back in Philly because I was kicked out of school. I had to come back to Philly, and I worked pretty hard in a store for a year. And it was just it wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't a Saul on Damascus Road moment, but it was pretty drastic in me having to take some inventory of where I was at, where some of my choices were leading me, and seeing this is not a path that's going to end well. Something's got to change here.
So what were you living at home during that time?
Yeah, while I was back in Philly, I was living at home and working.
What did your parents think of what was going on? They must have been freaking out.
Well, they didn't really know any of this.
They didn't know you were kicked out of school?
That I can't remember. I just lived a very duplicitous life. I was that kid that used to hide report cards and say, "Yeah, they don't give those things out anymore." I was that guy. So I shut them out of my life, even though I still lived at home and stuff. But they didn't really know.
Is your mom going to listen to this and she's going to find out exactly what happened right now?
She might. Might need to be some blocking going on, but.
So when you took that year off, was this it was sort of a slowing down for you, taking inventory of your life? Was God a part of that?
Not overtly, so I wasn't very active, and again, it wasn't a dramatic come back to Jesus moment, but it was a slower roll, and I do remember thinking I need to take some action here. So about closer to the end of college, I started to try to be more active in experiencing God through different things. I do remember at the very end of college, I went to, I don't even remember what it's called now, but it was, JAMA. It was this large Korean American kind of big movement of revival. And I remember going to that at the end of college out in Colorado State.
Yeah.
And feeling something's different here. And after college, I came back to the Philly area. I was actually in Delaware and starting to go to law school. But a few friends of mine who I'd gone to school with in Penn State, they were back in Philly, and they were guys who I had experienced a lot of stuff with, but they had started to get involved with a church. God was doing some good stuff in them as well. Start involved in the church in Philly, and they invited me to come out with them. So I started to say, well, I should probably do that. This is a new stage in life. This is another chance. So started to go to that church
from Delaware.
Yeah, and it's not that far, but initially it was just to go to kind of do the church thing, and I don't want to go to church with people I don't know. I was that guy who would come in probably close to the end of the service just to say I did it, and like when they're collecting offering, I would still slip in and just come in the back and say I went to church.
Yeah.
But slower and slower, it got to the point where I would come in and I would be that guy that makes the preacher really awkward because he's preaching and I'm just like bawling because that message of grace just really started to grip my heart, where I felt like God wants me as well. And again, I think I was saved before then, but it was coming back to Him.
So you're in law school. God's doing a work in your life. You're not a lawyer now. So tell me about that.
No. Yeah. So I was, I started to get more involved in the church, and what became one evening or one Sunday started to become more and more times coming into the city. And I just started to really, I'm an extreme personality. At a certain point, I started to feel this conviction. I'm supposed to be telling people about Jesus all the time.
Yeah.
And I totally acknowledge if someone who is in my position now would tell me all this stuff, I would tell them, you are not ready. You need to finish school. If you are sincerely called to a lifetime of pastoral ministry, you need more training. You should not be going to seminary.
Right. Don't do it.
But again, with who I am, my pastor did even tell me some of that stuff. I'm like, yo, I'm doing this. So a year and a half into law school, I actually dropped out of law school.
Okay.
And just started to pursue a path of ministry, including seminary. Thing with my parents were, they're not the typical, my father's passed now, but they were not the typical Korean American parents that we would think of stereotypically. They were actually really happy when I dropped out of law school to pursue ministry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I only discovered this about a year ago. My cousins told me they said, do you know that during that whole time your mom would say when you were in some of your worst times, oh, he's going to become a pastor. And she was praying for that,
No way.
which I had no clue about because that's the funny thing now. If I meet people or reconnect with folks who knew me, decades ago, and
Yeah.
they find out I'm in ministry, they're kind of shocked because it just didn't seem like the path that would make sense.
Sure.
I dropped out of law school, and again, if I look back, I would have probably done it a little differently. But that's what was going on at the time. I wasn't fully prepared to go into seminary and ministry. There was a lot of life issues that I still think I hadn't fully processed, and it had to lead to a lot of pain. But looking back, it's part of God's, journey for me. And I've always had to learn stuff the hard way, and that's the way it's worked. But started to get involved at church, serving on staff, part-time, working with young adults.
And what kind of church was that?
The old Emmanuel Church in Philly. Now it's called Renewal.
Okay.
Well, this church, and that's you need to do a podcast on that with someone else, but this church is actually located right in West Philadelphia.
Okay.
So it's not in a neighborhood where there's predominantly Koreans, but
I see.
The church was predominantly at that time. Well, there was a whole first generation Korean speaking church, but also an English speaking congregation that started to become a little bit more multi-ethnic. At the time, it's still predominantly Korean American, though.
So you're in seminary and you're attending this church? Are you serving on staff at this church?
I started just by attending, but then things moved pretty quickly, became in leadership. And then once I started seminary, they brought me on in a part-time role to serve and be part of what was going on there.
And what was your role?
I was the young adult pastor of the Young Adult Fellowship. And so again, for me, everything takes long and hard. I was in seminary for 5 years. I would love to say it was because I was faithfully part-time while I was serving full-time in pastoral ministry. And I was a screw up. I was a scrub. I messed up so bad in school. I love the idea of being in ministry. I didn't have the discipline or the character, I think. Again, that's where I would have really pressed hard if I was guiding me at the time. You're not ready for this, but I was in it. I remember at a certain point in seminary after my first year, my GPA was so low, and I do have some sense of shame, so I'm not going to share how low it was, but it was so low. They brought me in for the talk to say, hey, we love you too much to let you keep doing this. You're not supposed to do this. And I remember crying, saying, I have no other options in life.
Wow.
Please let me do it and I'll get it better. And by God's grace, he helped me to slowly turn things around. But that's been a whole part of my journey. I'm not the model that I would hope anyone would follow because it's kind of a screwed up path.
So the seminary was telling you, hey, this is clearly not for you.
Yeah, more in just the academics, because I was doing so poorly. And I only, some of my journey is in getting more ownership of even my mental health and some of the more self-awareness and deeper pains. I think even back then, I would have seasons of almost manic, kind of like, I'm on fire for God, I can do anything.
Yeah.
But then the other extreme poles were about as low as you can go, where I just stop. It's hopeless. It doesn't even matter. And I would just not do what I'm supposed to do. Some of that, I just didn't know what was going on at the time. I probably attributed it more to I'm just spiritually, something's wrong with me. But it led to a destruction in a lot of areas of my life, whether work, school, relationships. And, hindsight is whatever it is. But now I can look back and see, I had to own what was happening. But at the same time, there were other factors involved.
So would you say that you use the word destructive behaviors, but now when it was in college, it was sort of like physically destructive. But in seminary, you're talking about almost like an emotional destruction or a spiritual destruction. Was that because you were still processing sort of the deep pains of shame and identity?
I think so. And, I think there's so many, it's a multifaceted thing. There's so many different things involved with it.
Sure.
I think if I would look back on the time now, that is where I received my most significant development in who I am as a pastor. But it was also a season where my idea of what it meant to be a good pastor was this kind of image. And I had to do everything to present that image especially because I didn't feel like I fit that mold.
Okay.
So it was a lot of external image building, trying to keep up certain airs of what I thought a good, faithful pastor in this kind of second generation Korean American model is. I mean, you've been there. But then inside feeling, man, I'm not that in every way. and I've got to keep things secret and private and hide.
Yeah.
And I think so. A lot of those different factors were involved. So it was destructive, but on the outside, I think I was starting to do some okay ministry, really rough. I was
Yeah.
really rough. But on the inside, there was still some of that hating myself, not feeling like I knew who I was. So yeah, still processing through all those things.
So how long were you at Emmanuel?
I was there for a few years and then started coming on staff. I was there till about 4 years of seminary, and then this is another part of it. So the normal path for most of the guys, and some of those common friends, is you go through
Yeah.
seminary, you serve at the church, and you're so spiritual. They invite you to come on once you graduate to become part of the staff. I just assumed that would be my path too. And I remember my pastor at the time, and he was just, he loved me so much, but he's just real straight. He just told me, yeah, we just don't think this is going to work. It's not a fit.
Oh
I
man.
was crushed. I was
Oh,
crushed because what it did was also brought out all the insecurities I had about myself. And
sure.
sometimes you think you're fooling yourself, but then when you hear from other people, you're like, oh,
Right.
okay, other people see that too. So,
Right.
so
And they're hiring your friends.
Oh, exactly, exactly. And and just to give just to not to cast blame, I mean, you can't hire everyone. So it's not like they probably could have made something work, but they had to choose.
Yeah.
And I remember just feeling such a moron, feeling such a loser, but these are things you can only look back and see. That caused me to get on a path where literally right after those conversations, we were sending out a new church from there, City Line Church, led by Pastor Steve Kim, who's currently in Virginia. He
Okay.
was starting a new church that wanted to be a multi-ethnic church in another area of the city. And because of these situations, he asked me, and he's just too nice of a guy. He said, "Hey, do you want to come join me as my staff at this new church?"
Yeah.
And my seminary at the time, I was coming to an end there. They approached me about saying, "Hey, we're looking for a part-time admissions counselor. Would you like to come on?" And all of these things worked at the same time to provide this way for me to start to become an adult, be part of this new church that really, I think, stirred up a multi-ethnic vision of what church could be. Because now it's a little bit more in vogue. Back then, there were not too many people doing it.
Sure.
And it starts, and being part of my school was biblical seminary. Now it's called Missio. They were engaging in conversations about what does it look like to do missional ministry in a world that's changing. I'd never heard that kind of language in the churches I was part of.
Yeah.
And all of those factors working together, man, I'm going to get teary eyed. I got to be careful here. I look back now. My wife was a student, and at that time we weren't married. Obviously, she was a student. She was living in Baltimore, but she was commuting to do this crazy program at the seminary. And in her last few months of school, we finally met. We didn't know each other. We met. We had some common
Okay.
friends, and now we're married. I ended up moving to Baltimore. All of these things, I look back and say, if things had gone the way that I would have designed, and
Right.
it wouldn't have looked the way it's happened now.
Right.
Like, I needed almost things to not work out the way I wanted them to for all of these amazing good things I've been able to be part of, including my wife, including the church, including Baltimore. I needed all of these things to fall through the cracks for other things to come out of it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So then you moved to Baltimore. So what do you do?
I think I just had a higher estimation of myself. I thought I can get any job I want. I didn't have anything. So the first six,
How old are you at this point?
I was 34.
Okay.
So for the first 6 months or so, it was just miserable. Our marriage took a hit because of it, because I was just depressed. I
Mm,
actually ended up having to keep some of that part-time job working at the seminary in Philly because I couldn't get any work.
yeah.
And I would like commute back and forth a couple times a week. It was just miserable. But what ended up happening eventually, the church that we were both part of in Baltimore, the pastor there, Roger Kim, tremendous mentor for me, he invited me to come on. He recognized some gifts in me. He said, "Hey, why don't you come on part-time staff at the church?" We were meeting downtown in Baltimore, and I started to do a little ministry, and things moved very quickly. He recognized, and I look back now, he recognized things in me that I don't think anyone ever has before.
Hmm.
He told me, "I think you need to be leading." And I was like, I'm not that.
Yeah.
No one had ever looked at me as a leader in church. I was kind of like that goofy guy that was, you send the people who need to talk to someone because I'm good at that. But I'm not the preacher.
Yeah.
I Man, then you're gonna bring out all my trauma here, Rich. But
Come on, let's do it.
I remember even early in ministry back in Philly, I had a pastor who loved me, and he was trying to be really kind, but told me, you know what, Dan, not everyone is meant to be a preacher.
Oh, wow.
After one of my sermons, he was trying to be really encouraging.
Was he though? Was he?
I think so. Yeah, genuinely. It was for like affirmation, correction, more trying to meet a
Yeah.
precedent in my gifts, which he thought were like, and I think are still there, like counseling and building community things. But
Yeah.
look at my preaching, and I had never seen myself this way. But then once I was in Baltimore, my pastor was like, "Yo, you need to be leading."
Yeah.
So he brought me out. He increased me to full time to start leading at the church campus we were at in downtown Baltimore. So it was a multiplying church with a vision to start different churches.
What was the name of that church?
Grace Life Church.
Okay.
So I started to lead there, but then very quickly, God started to impress upon me a vision. As great as this is, you need to be going out and starting a new church as well. So probably doing that about a year, things have moved really quickly at that point. We felt this calling to be sent out by the church to start a new church in the city. And that's the church we started, the Village.
And what year was that?
We officially launched in 2008, but then there was work ahead of that, but 2008.
So leading up to this vision to plant the church in downtown Baltimore, what sort of preparation did you have for yourself, for your family, for your leadership team?
Well, I look back now, we did just, regular core team meetings and preparation development. But I look back now, it was just terrible because and it's not that there were not resources out there, but at the time I just was not aware enough to know what I needed, how to do it.
Yeah.
So that's why my current work now, I work with church planners in Baltimore. I'm so adamant about helping guys to try to prepare and do things as much as they're able to well, because I feel like I didn't do that well. If in any ways it was God's mercy and power and just my stubborn bullheaded grit, just to like kind of push things through.
Yeah.
And if I'm being honest, it's what caused a lot of the pain in the early couple of years of the church plant, because I was operating out of brokenness, just sheer determination, but not very wise. And I probably ended up hurting some people in ways that I became aware of. But if I could have gone back and done it differently, but it is what it is. So we were just doing a lot of building within our team, but also trying to reach out to the city, be involved in large areas. Our goal was always not to be a church just for ourselves as a church, but a church for the city. What does it look like to become aware of the issues of the larger city, especially in areas of justice and mercy? And what would like the church look like to be that city on a hill within Baltimore?
So leading up to your church plant, the church in West Philly, the church, City Line Church and Grace Life Church, these are all, you said, multi-ethnic congregations, but they're also all being led by Korean pastors, Korean American pastors. And so was this sort of what you saw as a model for the type of church that you would want?
I think so. And I think what it started to do for me was open my eyes to the possibility of reaching people beyond just those who share a common appearance or ethnicity with you. So Emmanuel Church, even though it was predominantly Korean first and second generation English speaking, but it was located in West Philly, which is a community predominantly African American, African. So the church had to acknowledge, because for a long time, people in the community didn't know that it was a church. They just thought it was a bunch of Asian people driving in these nice cars to do some stuff. They didn't even know it was a church. So God did some, supernatural things to open up doors, even through tragedy, so that the church would engage with the community. So that started to open my eyes. And I was involved in the West Philly outreach into the community. For one summer, I even led our camp in the neighborhood. And those things started to stir my attention. I mean, I was a blatant racist when I was growing up. That was some of my story as well. God started to change some of that. And then City Line Church was intentionally started to be a multi-ethnic church. And this was early in the day, so we didn't know fully what we were doing, but Pastor Steve had a courageous vision, and we saw a community come together. Even to this day, that's a wonderful mosaic of folks. So that again was another step of the journey. And then Grace Life Church in Baltimore, even to another level, what does it really mean to be a multi-ethnic dynamic church of different cultures? So, and again, I think you had, like you mentioned, these are diverse communities led by Korean Americans. So I started to believe maybe I can do this. But what I also started to see is I wanted to take it to another level and say, multi-ethnic is good. And I use those terms kind of together, but oftentimes it can be people who are pretty similar, even if ethnicity is different, but culturally,
Right.
including things like class and socioeconomic status.
Sure.
But start to dream, especially in Baltimore, what would it look like a church to be multicultural, bringing together different cultures along with a multi-ethnic representation, but also people um, who've got degrees out the wazoo, and people who haven't graduated eighth grade, people who are,
Yeah.
blue collar, white collar, people who are, all these different things. And that was some of the dreams of what would it look like to be a church to get started like that. But that doesn't happen if I didn't have some of these experiences from others. And I think what it allowed me to do, this is just a little bit more uniquely for me as a
Yeah.
Korean American. I remember when we first started the village, and I cringe when I say this now, but we didn't put my name or face anywhere on some of the initial promo or website, just because I still had some of that deep shame.
Really?
As a Korean American, people are not going to come to your church if you're Asian, because they're going to think it's a Asian church or a Korean church. And
Wow.
at the time, I was driven by the fact we're not going to be a Korean church. We're not going to be an Asian church. And
Right.
I'm a liability in that. And it just sounds embarrassing saying it out loud now, but that's what some of the reality back then was.
Wow.
Yeah. So God has done a good work in me to kind of embrace who I am, and that it's not a liability. But if anything, God has been using all the different things in my life, all the stuff that I used to run from.
Yeah.
So where I think about multi-ethnic church ministry now, pastoral ministry, is I'm a big advocate of it, and I actually just wrote something about it. So I'm a big believer in a multicultural church. I don't think every church has to be multicultural unless you're just
Sure.
blatantly racist. You know that?
Right. Right.
Because, even I talked to a lot of younger Korean guys who are interested in this. I asked them questions that, is this really the right path for you? Because if it's not, there's nothing to be embarrassed about that, because everyone
Right.
needs ministry. But for me, because I've always felt in my life, I never fit in anywhere.
Mm.
Whichever group I was part of, I always felt like, I'm a chameleon. I can make it work, but man, I don't really feel like I belong here.
Yeah.
Where I used to kind of resent that, now I see that's allowed me to lead a more multi-ethnic, multicultural congregation, because I have no problem being with almost anyone.
Right.
And most of the time for them to also feel like I can identify with them. And it's been God's grace to kind of take the things that I've always felt ashamed about and redeem them, to see, no, this is actually you being Korean American. You used to think it was something that would prevent these things from happening. Actually, some of what's happening in your ministry is because precisely of who you are.
Right.
And don't elevate that to be above anything else, but redeem it just like any other area of who we are.
Right. It's a strength, not a weakness.
Exactly.
Hey, I just wanted to tell you that earlier this year, Dan's brother and his daughter both were diagnosed with leukemia. And this brought to awareness the drastic underrepresentation of Asian Americans in the National Bone Marrow Registry. So I didn't want to tell you Dan's story without also giving you a challenge, regardless of your race, to join the registry and possibly save a life. You can sign up online at join.bethematch.org. And now back to the show. As part of your story, as you've been saying, just leading out of your own brokenness, out of your own insecurities, you're saying you don't want to have your face on the website because of the insecurity that you have about your own self. But yet you're sort of known as someone who talks so openly about reconciliation and about racial justice in the city of Baltimore. And you have an Ethnos Conference that talks about these issues. How did you go from being someone who doesn't want their face to be on the church website to now somebody who's standing up in front of crowds and talking about racial reconciliation?
Yeah, I mean, that makes me sound better than I am. I probably did want my face on all this stuff, but I thought if I did it, I'd be killing the church. And so it was all shame and fear. It was ultimately looking at who I thought I was and thinking it's not going to be enough to do what I really want to do. Because some of these visions of reconciliation, that's been in me since The way I describe it, so people, I have conversation with folks that, how do you know the Christian faith is real? How do you know these things? And I can give them all the different evidences that I believe are very valid. But ultimately, I come down to my own story where I used to legitimately be a raging, angry, violent, racist person.
Yeah.
And God did something in me. And you can fake some stuff, but like he's taken what was like bitter anger. I hated everyone. I mean, I even hated other Asian people at times, right? I hated
Right. Right.
everyone. And God changed something to now where people I used to look at with enmity and bitterness and rage. Now I'm like, I need to be family with them.
Yeah.
Even if we have nothing in common, we're meant to be family. That's the story of reconciliation.
Right.
So that's what I tell people. That's how I know this thing is real, because I know myself. I'm not a good guy. God has intervened in my life to create a supernatural love that I can't produce or fake just because I think it's a good idea. Like, this is something real. So I think for me, it's coming to grips with all the different things you mentioned and encountering some of the different shame that can really, and for Asians, we talk about the shame we have. I think a lot of the shame is diminishing what God can do through us, especially for me. I mean, we're kind of close to the same age. We grew up in a generation in America. You didn't see any role models that look like you anywhere,
Right.
that were doing significant things in America. So the implicit message you start to internalize is, well, I can do some stuff. I mean, I know I can do ministry, but it's only to this level.
Right.
And I better work within stay in my lane, if we want to use that kind of language.
Yeah.
And it just, I think shame drives that. So again, it doesn't mean that not doing that is any less, but I also encourage some people that I look at, I'm like, yo, you can probably do far more than you've given yourself credit for.
Yeah.
You are going to be able to impact people that maybe no one else thinks you can, and be self-aware enough to know where you need to grow in that.
Yeah.
And maybe that you can't do everything, but you can probably do far more than you think. And I think from my story, I've talked about being a late bloomer, and I shared some of that with you here. I am not a model of the path to getting to where I want to be, but God has often used my things of brokenness, things where I felt inadequate. Honestly, in humility, I think so much a story of reconciliation, there needs to be humility. We talk about issues of kind of even with church planting, where it can be a colonial idea of like kind of come in and we're the savior. And I think for me, it's been, I need to continually be learning from other people. So even when you're talking about influencing others and being in a position, there's things I've done intentionally to put my voice out there, but a lot of it's just trying to be faithful to what I believe God's called me to do. And then if he wants to give more exposure to that, I want to just be used in those ways. So, and we talked about the conference, Ethnos Conference. We're about to hit the 5th one this spring, and
Nice.
really excited about it. The real reason we started that back in the day was and this is my flesh, but I would look at every conference that people would announce on Twitter or Facebook or the internet, and I would just get mad. And it was my own stuff. I would just get mad because my first thing is I would go to the speaker list.
Yeah.
And maybe they got Francis in there, right? But other than that, it's like
they got one.
Yeah, you're like, yo, this is not for me. This is not for me. And I was just mad, and it would, again, in my own stuff, I had to learn how to process that. But the way I've always tried to attack or approach things when I get mad is, well, I can stay mad or I can do something about it. Let that direct me. I was like, well, forget y'all. I'm going to start my own conference then.
Yeah.
And that's why from the beginning, we've just made it a very big value that, we're going to get some folks that anyone's going to recognize nationally, but we're going to try to empower voices across the spectrum, men and women of different experiences and obviously different ethnicities who might not be represented in the normal conference in the evangelical world. At least in what we can control, we're going to try to do that.
Yeah. I mean, one year you invited me to do a breakout. So you were reaching deep, man. You were really reaching down.
No, you killed it, man. We got so much good feedback from that. That was epic.
Who are some of the models that you looked up to as you're leading into this racial justice and racial reconciliation space as a Korean American?
Yeah. I think it's probably some of the more prominent people who, especially when we were starting the village, we were looking towards, and at the time they might not have even been as prominent now.
Yeah.
But for me, they were, because they were Korean American people like Sun Chan Ra and Eugene Cho.
Yeah.
Chinese American, but like Ken Fong, other
Yeah.
people like that, Dave Gibbons,
Mm-hmm.
and then people I knew a little bit more closely, people like Young Kim, Min Chong, Steve Kim, people like that,
Yeah.
encouraged me to kind of pursue this. But at the same time, and this is not to make it sound like it's more elevated or better, but I felt some of our experience in Baltimore was just a little different, even than some of those voices talked about.
Totally.
Just because some of these issues, especially when it comes to the poor, my experience is it's not easy. Nothing's easy, but it's a little kind of what you're talking about. We can lead multi-ethnic churches, and it creates a little bit more of an ease of doing that when everyone's kind of on the same page, financially, place in life.
Right.
My desire was, even when we started church, and as I'm raising up pastors and planters now, I'm like, if we're really going to do this right, you're going to have to die to what it looks like to be a good preacher, or consider a good preacher among some of our tribes
Huh.
that value like a really academic, like in the sky. I'm like, if we're reaching people with, I mean, honestly, like reading level, that comprehension that might not be there. Yeah, you can sound real impressive to some folks,
Yeah.
but you're going to be totally missing ministry. And those are things, I think, the big lessons that hopefully I try to pass on to others. And it's so I've gotten critique on my preaching before, not as much now, but earlier on,
Yeah.
I've gotten critique, and some of it was because I just was bad and I had to learn. But other parts of it was, it's like, it's not really like reformed, or not very
Mm.
gospel centered, or whatever that means. So I try to make really clear, it's not that. I mean, I've been to seminary. I know I can put together a 3-point sermon the way we're supposed to. I'm not saying I would do it well, but I know how to do that. But there's intention, because our bigger goal that we're striving for is to make disciples, to reach those outside of the bounds that we might normally be. If that's going to be the case, I got to die to some myself.
Yeah.
I got to die to some of my own ideas of what it is. Again, never compromising the truth of orthodoxy, but being in a place so that more and more people can hear about who Jesus is.
One of the things that I've been thinking about was just sort of this generational moment. And I looked to my father, who immigrated here as a single person and got married here. But the opportunity for him to assimilate to American culture was sort of impossible, right? My parents are not assimilated to American culture in the same way that my son is.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the burden of the first generation. The assimilation is impossible. And then when I look at my son and my daughter, assimilation, it's still hard. But in some ways, the way society is moving, assimilation for them is sort of inevitable, in that the way that they are being looked at in society compared to my father is vastly different world. They are, in the schools and having friends and things like that in the community that look very different than what the social structure would look like for my parents in the 1960s and 1970s. But I think specifically of our generation, you, me, and people that are our age, that really had to bridge that assimilation pathway, going from one generation who assimilation was impossible, and within just 2 generations, really seeing sort of assimilation as inevitable. But as this specific generation, really needing to bridge all of that and having to navigate through all of that. I don't really have fully formed thoughts around that, but it's just something that I've been thinking about. I think about what a unique generation you and I belong to, in that we had to bridge this gap.
Yeah, man, that's real right there. And I don't, we talk a lot about self-awareness and even past trauma and stuff. And I think only even in the past few years, I'm really starting to dig into some of that.
Yeah.
Because I think some of, not to over elevate, but some of what guys like you and others we know, like us, we've had to internalize a lot of stuff. We've had to kind of just grit.
Yeah.
People can argue all day about systemic injustice. And
right.
The reality is, things are just not, in our generation, we're not just easily set for us to just be like every larger majority culture and it'll just happen if you do the right things.
Right.
You've got to almost have an extra thing. You've got to have someone who advocates for you.
Yeah.
And my hope for younger generations that will not be as hard. And that's one of the reasons I tried, my wife probably more than anyone, like, man, you post a lot of stuff, or you out there a lot. There's a part of me that, and this brings in our whole Korean kind of like self whatever stuff like don't be arrogant, don't talk about yourself.
Right.
And I wrestle with that. And I think, honestly, I think Western culture could learn some of that a little bit more. But I think the reason why I put myself out there is not just for me to put my stuff out there, but for other people who are watching and who are following and maybe even dreaming to say, okay, I'm not alone in this.
Yeah.
I'm not alone in this. This is possible. But the reason I put it out there, and some people think I over racialize stuff or over talk about things, I think it's to recognize, things look like there's much more opportunity, and there is. It's amazing.
Right.
Even as an Asian American, there's so much more opportunity. And we see even larger organizations bringing on leadership. So it's not just token, but let's not just accept that, because even that can hit a certain level that the larger culture is comfortable with. And let's not just tolerate being accepted and given something and say, okay, well, you're in now, if it's not engaging in deeper issues. Or, well, why are not more in? It's almost like, to be a minority, in majority culture, you got to be extraordinary to make it. And we can highlight those people and we love it and it's exciting. But that should become more normal for folks
100%.
who are excellent. So that's why I continue to talk about this stuff, because I'll just be real right now. If it's just about me, I'm kind of good. I've got my space. I'm doing stuff, but I'm always thinking about those who are coming behind me now. And I want to make the pathway for them a little less bumpy than it might have to be if I have any control over that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's why I started the podcast.
Yeah, I love what you're doing, man. This is exactly what we need. You've got platform. Platform, it can be bad, but I think it's a real good thing if we're trying to raise up others that people might not even be aware. I mean, I love what you're doing.
It's funny that you talk about the need for that minority to be exceedingly exceptional. And I was having a conversation with my friend, and we were talking about Parasite, and we were talking about what a landmark award it was for, the film industry, for the, international feature films. But at the same time, we were sort of lamenting the fact that Parasite had to be almost a perfect movie for it to be even considered, for it to be an upset, right? I mean, it wasn't even the favorite.
Yep.
Just to think about how many other movies out there that are international movies that are good, that are great, but that aren't even being considered, because for that international film to be considered, it has to be so much better, exceedingly better than any other American film. And it's in the same way, sort of like generationally, like you look at the generation ahead of us, the Francis Chans, the Eugene Cho's, Sun Chan Ra's, like you have to have such a skill, such a mind to be able to be on that platform on the stage, that you and I think as we look to the future generations, we say, well, we just hope that won't be the case in the future, that you don't have to be exceedingly exceptional and over and above, anybody who's majority culture.
And man, we get into some deep stuff, so as I think about our church, and I think I told you about when we started to make a turn and more Asian Americans started to come to the church. This is embarrassing to say now, but at the beginning, I found an inner rebelling against that. I almost started to get concerned.
Yeah.
Like, what if too many Asians come? What if we start to become an Asian church? And man, that's been a whole good process, because for a while there, I think in trying to pursue this kind of more multicultural, again, which I fully affirm and I think is really good, I almost felt like I had to diminish who I was, including who I was around. So I stopped going to Korean conferences, retreats. I just wouldn't accept those kind of things.
Yeah.
I was like, I've got to be in other spaces. And what happened was I realized one of my idols was I felt like this made me stand out by leading a church that was not predominantly Asian American.
Right.
Like this makes me more impressive or better, or gives me a better sense of worth. And God just had to like draw that out of me and lead me to repentance, to say, yo, you are highlighting the wrong things. This is still your shame speaking. And ultimately, now again, our church has grown, and thankfully it's not just growing Asian Americans, but it's growing others, but there's a lot more Asian Americans.
Yeah.
But I celebrate that now.
Right.
The way I would think of it is, Asians are one of the only people who ever say things like, oh, man, I think we're becoming too Asian.
100%.
No other group says that.
Yeah.
Like maybe white people, but that's different, right? But no other minority group says we are becoming too Asian. That's a problem. I'm like,
100%.
I'm like, yo, Yeah, I mean, if it's like because there's stuff that we could do better, sure, let's address it. But let's not be ashamed of who's coming, because there are people who need to also hear this message. I think about, I love every person who comes to our church. I think about the young Asian dude, maybe in college, really kind of timid and meek when they're around the larger populations. But that guy, like when they're with other Koreans, they're like the life of the party, gregarious, they're fun. But then they like mouse up when it comes to being amongst others.
Yeah.
Like I want them to see in me, and not, again, I'm pointing to Christ ultimately, but as I represent Christ, see someone who looks a little bit like them, leading peoples, and not just Asian peoples, but leading other peoples. And because, representation does matter, especially in leadership and authority, and not just as tokens, but actual leadership. I'm thinking about that young dude to say, dude, you can lead in every sphere of your life, and who you are is not an impediment. It's not in the way. If anything, if you bring that to God, he's going to use that to make you even a better you. You're no better than anyone else, but you're no worse.
For years, when Dan was a young man, he didn't quite know who he was and how he fit in the society. But through the journey that God put him on, he's found out who he is and how he fits, and a large part of that is helping others find out who they are and how they fit. And that is a great story of reconciliation and healing. If you'd like to follow Dan and his many posts, you can find him on Instagram at danhyun1 and Twitter at VillageDanHyun. And if you're interested in attending the Ethnos Conference, they were postponed this year because 2020, but you can stay up to date at ethnosbaltimore.org. Thanks for listening and subscribing to The Pursuit. Would you do me a favor and just turn to the person next to you right now and just tell them, yo, you gotta listen to this. Thanks for always helping me get the word out. Now, as we go, remember, you may not know where your journey ends, but you can find God all along the path. And yet never invited back.
Oh, yo! So this is your kingdom mentality that I'm inviting into, Rich. That you are giving space for someone else.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.